I want to get better at art, don't you? But what a daunting goal. Noble, perhaps, but how do you begin to climb that mountain? My name is Zach, and I was a middle and high school art teacher for 11 years. In that time, I had the opportunity to work with thousands of students across the entire artistic spectrum, each with their own hopes and dreams. All of the successful students had art goals. I don't recall a one of them that didn't have a specific goal they wished to obtain. And I think therein lies an important piece of wisdom. A goal may be necessary for achieving anything artistically. What follows is one way of structuring your artistic goals. We are all individuals and will all have our own paths, but there are pieces of this that will benefit everyone. Let's take a look at what form this can actually take. Part 1. Start with defining a large, overarching goal. The biggest thing you have to begin with is having your end goal in mind. Think of this like the destination if you're going on a road trip or a vacation. You know where you want to go. Now there might be a lot of different potential paths to get there, but it's important to understand where it is you want to go. Artistically, there are so many distinct potential endpoints. If you really enjoy video games, it might be as complicated as developing the skills necessary to develop your own game, or at least work in the industry designing characters. I've been sinking a lot of time over the last few months into Elden Ring, and I could easily see someone desiring to create From Software style of characters, shrouded in mystery and withering from the slow decay of power and time. You have to start with something like this, a defined, large-scale goal. This overarching goal allows you to later develop benchmarks that will be the rungs on the ladder to actually climb toward that destination. If your goal is to draw mechs, robots, spaceships, and other things like the Star Wars franchise has to offer, your journey is obviously going to be very different from the landscape painter or the portrait photographer. There is simply a different journey there. One is not better than the other, but you need to understand your goal so you have the faintest of inclinations as to which direction to even set out in. Part 2. Define the pieces of that overarching goal. This is going to be very particular to your personal goals. Think of this like a tree. The tree itself is the overarching goal. The branches hold the potential fruits of your labors, the products you dream of producing, and each of the paths or pieces of that overarching goal are like roots that gird and support the tree itself. They allow it to be held up and nourished. Without those roots, without all of those roots, the tree dies. It has no hope of existing into the future. So you need to define what each of the roots are for your personal goal. What are the pieces that have to exist so the goal can be achieved? Now, most artistic goals are going to have a dozen or more paths, a dozen or so roots that help structure and support the goal. But you can't work on 8, 10, 12 things at a time. You have to work on 1 or 2 at a time. It becomes very quickly overwhelming if you try to dive into all of them simultaneously. In almost all artistic ventures, you are going to have the same basic things. The elements and principles of design, starting with things like line, value, color, and the basics of three-dimensionality, are going to be present regardless of your end goal. Some of these roots are likely consistent across all disciplines, regardless of goal. These are the basics. That's why they're called the basics. These are for beginners, and if that is you, that is great. There are a lot of resources out there for beginners, and your goal is to just start making art. Once you get past the basics, or have a fundamental enough understanding of them, you will start to move on to the pieces that are specific to your particular goal, where you need to invest your time. That might be anatomy, it might be understanding robotic components, or it might be lighting. These are all pieces of that overarching goal. I am being intentionally vague here, by the way, because all of these pieces and paths are going to be determined by your specific goal. We are already in personal territory here. We have already dipped into metaphor, and if I try to construct a metaphor for every potential ending, this video will be several days long. As you follow along, I would recommend taking notes. Write down what your potential goal is. Don't be afraid to write down several different overarching goals. Don't be embarrassed about what your goal might be. There is no problem, no need for pressure to define it correctly, perfectly, the first time. Or maybe ever. You don't need any extra pressure to be perfect at this stage. At this point in time, your desire should be to nail down that goal. But if you are like any other humans I've encountered in my life, it's not going to be perfect the first time. You might have 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 potential goals at the beginning. As you define them, work with them, dissect them, you will come to a conclusion. For the next 6 months or a year, that will be your overarching goal. It will change over time. You'll refine it at some point. There is not always a direct path to the goal. Or more specifically, there is not always one direct path to the goal. And sometimes there are 10 correct paths. So as you are listening and taking notes, start thinking about what your goal might potentially be and how you would break that down into its constituent pieces. It might seem like a lot at this point, and that's okay. It is a lot. It's daunting and it's a large task. I wish I could tell you that it really is simple, that you only need to focus on these 10, 15, or 60 steps and you will be able to attain your art goal. But I can't. It's hard. A lot of people start the journey, but most people don't finish it. If you want to finish the journey, at least knowing what your destination is, what the paths are, and the benchmarks necessary to get there will help you have a better chance of actually sticking to the path and finishing. Part 3. Choose which path to start with. Now that you have a goal and the potential routes to support that goal, you have to pick where to start. As I mentioned earlier, if you are an absolute beginner or need a refresher since you've been out of the game for a while, this is pretty simple. Start with the basics. You focus on how to represent things. You focus on line, on value, on color. There is a lot here that you can focus on for 6 months to a year just to set you up for the beginning of your journey proper. It's almost like kindergarten before you start the rest of elementary school. Now, once you have the basics down, you have to decide that path, just like we mentioned earlier. Let's assume this path for the moment is anatomy or animal design. If you wanted to design creatures for games, you're going to have a basic understanding of how they function. What differentiates a reptile from a mammal, for example. So one of your routes might be animal design. Well, now you can focus on this path for a given amount of time. You can start to research different animals. Perhaps start with ones that are comfortable for you to ease the barrier of entry. If you drew cats, dogs, and horses growing up, maybe that's a great place to start. Start with things that are easier for you to slide into the path a little more simply. From there, you can move into other vertebrates. And frankly, if your first path is to design and work with animals, I would even subdivide that route into multiple categories. Some of these might be the differences between vertebrates and invertebrates. The skills that are necessary to draw an ant are obviously quite different than those necessary to construct a cow. Now, there are going to be principles that overlap, especially as it pertains to rendering or how limbs are attached. But focus on mammals for a while, then move on to birds and amphibians, and then go on to things like spiders and squids and snails. And all of this makes up just that one route, that one distinct path and piece that you must have along the path to your goal. This gives you something that can be diced up into bite-sized pieces, whereas the whole tree itself is just too much. It's too overwhelming. And indeed, maybe that singular route is overwhelming, and that's why subdividing it is going to be beneficial. Now that you know that this is one of the routes, one of the pieces, and you've decided where to begin, you can start moving forward. Part 4. Define benchmarks along each of the paths and what constitutes having met that benchmark. Moving into the smaller pieces, you can start laying out smaller goals and things to attain. This is something that comes very naturally to me. We might already be in the weeds for those of you that are more spontaneous in how you approach your artwork. I like to have it all laid out in a logical framework. In fact, one of my struggles is that I can drown in the water of planning and trick myself into thinking I have accomplished something from all the time that I've put into it. When in reality, I can spend 10 hours planning out how I am going to learn how to draw a thing, but if I don't actually sit down and draw, I've accomplished nothing. This stage is something that is important, but I wouldn't put a ridiculous amount of time into it. So define the benchmarks. If we go back to the creature design idea we were just talking about, once you put a certain amount of time into drawing mammals, can you draw those mammals from memory? Can you draw a goat from memory now? A giraffe? A bull? You can? Great! There's your first benchmark. Next benchmark might be to create something that doesn't exist. Maybe you can draw goats because you've drawn 1,000 goats, but can you devise a cat with horns and the tail of another type of mammal? Can you do that? If you cannot, then go back and study the individual components of those creatures. You take a look at your attempt, analyze it, and decide what your weakness is and what you can do better. Maybe you did a really good job shoving all the pieces together, but the eyes are too large for the size of the animal, and you need to be more cognizant of that next time. As you analyze each of those pieces, you will understand how to progress and how to hit that next benchmark. Now, here's the part that is going to be really based on who you are as an individual. How many of these benchmarks do you develop? It's probably not prudent to define 10 benchmarks for each of the 12 roots of your tree because you will spend hours or days doing nothing but laying out all those pieces, all of the paths, and that's probably too much. That's something that I could fall into very easily and trick myself into feeling productive when I really haven't been. So you might want to start with only developing benchmarks for the particular route that you decided to work on at that point. Now here is why I think the benchmarks are particularly important. And this comes from my time in the classroom and from my personal experiences. We as artists are so critical of ourselves that it can be hard to see when we have actually progressed. If you have these benchmarks, you have a moment in your memory that you can return to, a moment when you laid out a potential goal for the future that was impossible at that moment, something that you could not do, but you wished that you could in the future. And once you have obtained that goal, you can look back to when you laid it out initially. Obviously, you couldn't achieve that goal when you came up with the plan, and now you can. It's much easier to say, oh wow, when I built this benchmark, I couldn't do this thing, and now I can. That's success. That's a win. And that dopamine hit is absolutely essential. That is why I think that defining the benchmarks is so beneficial for us as artists. We don't always do a great job of remembering where we were and where we are. And we have a tendency to be just as hard on ourselves regardless of where we are in the journey, not acknowledging any of our growth. That makes this difficult journey even harder than it needs to be. So having the benchmarks defined and being able to have a little celebration when you hit one, when you can achieve that thing, is a beneficial addition to the longevity of your artistic pursuits. So this was 4 steps in setting out an artistic goal for yourself. This manner of thing works really well for people who are like me, who are very structured and have a tendency to overdo the logic of things. It's not going to work for everyone. Probably. But the overarching goal portion and subdividing of the goals will be beneficial to any artist, I think. A lot of us have these goals subconsciously. It's not always something we have spoken about or written down, and I do believe it is beneficial to write it down, to have it be something you are thinking about and processing daily. It prevents you from ending up in the weeds and losing track of your potential and desired destination. I hope this was beneficial to you. If you have other goal-setting strategies that you use, please leave them in the comments below. I would love to start a discussion and discourse about this. And if there's some really lovely nuggets that appear in the comments as well, then that's just a future video. Have a good one, y'all. See you soon.